Thank you, Dr. Garabekyan, for that kind introduction. I want to thank everyone for coming up here today. Before I talk about this study and its main findings, I want to take a moment to present the context of the research and express my appreciation to a few people that helped me reach this point. The history of this research goes back to 2004, when I started my doctoral studies at the Center of Middle Eastern and Islamic Studies at the University of Bergen, Norway. Because of personal reasons, I wasn't able to finish it in due time and submit the thesis to the evaluation committee. After I returned back to Armenia in 2008, I had that ghost chasing me all the time. Even though I had my degree from the National Academy of Sciences of Armenia, I was hoping that one day I would be able to earn my doctoral degree from Norway. Then in November 2011, I had a brief conversation with Dr. Armen Turkurian, who inquired about the progress of my doctoral thesis. His question was yet another strong signal to speed up my research. Then in a few months, in the spring of 2012, in another conversation, Sharistan Melkonyan told me in a nice and uplifting manner, "Varam, you got to finish it." So, to my students, mostly, a sentence, a word, a look, an advice from a friend, colleague, even from a complete stranger, can change your lives and our plans. A word said with care can inspire us and motivate beyond belief. What happened after 2012 was about one thing: getting the job done, submit the doctoral dissertation, and after defense, work on the changes suggested by the evaluation committee, and if possible, publish the study in a prestigious academic press. In October 2017, when the first draft was ready, I started contacting a few publishing houses. My research got immediate attention. I realized that I could negotiate on the terms of the contract. Then the contract proposed by Palgrave Macmillan was the most acceptable one. It took 1.5 years, hundreds of email exchanges before we reached the publication point. Advice and support from several people were instrumental. I want to recognize the invaluable help of my mentor, Ruben Safarsan, the director of the Institute of Oriental Studies at the National Academy of Sciences, whom I respect enormously. Unfortunately, he couldn't make it. Dr. Ruben Melkonyan, who is here, my good friend, who is the Dean of the Faculty of Oriental Studies at the Yerevan State University, and Dr. Stefan Asturian from the University of Berkeley. With all these people, we have been able to build an intellectual synergy. Our goal was and is very simple: trying to know Turkey from within. A long list of names from Turkey, Norway, USA is still acknowledged in the preface of the book. However, there is one name that I want to emphasize, and that is Dr. Alina Garabekyan. She joined us in August last year and as our interim dean. Since then, she has played an instrumental role in many initiatives. In November, when she heard about my upcoming book, she got really excited and asked me in a nice manner, "Varam, would you like me to have a look at the final draft?" I had no idea that my innocent nodding would take much of her time from her incredibly busy schedule. She had to read the entire manuscript a few times and spent invaluable time on it. She polished the language with her impeccable English. She invested so much time in it, and I'm so grateful to her. Thank you, Alina, very much. I also want to thank my wife, Anahit, and my boys, Tigan and Haik, who are here today. They helped me immensely in times of despair and difficulties. Anahit was next to me all the time, ready to support any way she could. My sons also played an instrumental role in every stage of my research when I was looking for inspiration. My parents also played an important role in every stage of the project, and my mother-in-law, Alina, another Alina, was also incredibly supportive in helping out Anahit. Now about the book. In 2023, Turkey will celebrate its centennial. Like its predecessor, the Ottoman Empire, Republican Turkey has been and remains a perplexing country, not only for its own citizens and others in the region, but also for most of the world. Followers of the developments in modern Turkey realize that the country is undergoing a difficult period in its history, as notions of Erdogan's Turkey and other Turkeys collide. One may be tempted to look at the current context for explanations. while others turn to history to find the root causes of existing problems. Understanding the challenges that the Turkish state and society are currently facing requires examining country's relationship to its ideological foundations. Throughout its existence, the key ideas, principles, and norms of Kemalism, the founding ideological creed of the Republic of Turkey, have repeatedly emerged in politics, law, education, and public space. Despite recurrent setbacks, Kemalism has remained an integral part of political and social processes, generating public debates about its place and role in the future of Turkey. In one way, everything about Kemalism became sensitive, given the polemics surrounding its protagonists, defenders, and critics. Just a few examples suffice to show the complexity of these discussions. Some practitioners and observers loudly defend the synthesis of Islamism and Kemalism, pointing to the likelihood of compromise between these two conflicting creeds. Other scholars go beyond conventional assessments of the crisis of Kemalism, declaring its final demise. Still, others claim that Kemalism is immortal. Recent developments have only added ambiguity to these existing debates. Since the 1980s, Kurdish nationalism, political Islam, and rising conservatism visibly weakened Kemalism, and its followers hold on power. The results of the 2002 parliamentary elections are widely interpreted as a turning point between the past and future of the Republic of Turkey. The words of Muammer Kaylan present the complexity of the results of the 2002 elections and what implications they had on the perceptions of Kemalists. The second, the electoral victory of the Justice and Development Party and consequent political, social, and cultural reforms, which by and large overhauled the Kemalist legacy, have led to a renewed interest in Kemalism. These developments indicate, once again, that understanding the structure and framework of Kemalism is not an easy task. Its grip over the Turkish state and society has both tightened and weakened in the Republican era. At any rate, it is reasonable to attribute many challenges in modern Turkey to interpretations and applications of Kemalism. Against this backdrop, this study seeks to illumine another perspective which hopefully expands the breadth and depth of existing knowledge about Turkey and its ideological construction. So the primary purpose of this book is to determine existing problems and perspectives in interpretations of Kemalism. Firstly, it examines the evolution and internal dynamics of Kemalism. A lack of consensus about its structure, content, and form has always existed. Perhaps this explains why Kemalism was used and misused by different actors. The peculiarities of dominance and power are therefore discussed, providing a broader picture of the era that formed the foundations of Kemalism and shaped the behavior of its followers. Kemalism, both as an ideological construct and pattern of transformation, has given rise to numerous interpretations and perspectives. Although it is practically impossible to discuss them all, some major patterns are clearly discernible. It is through the study of these interpretations that several problems have emerged. Second, examining existing problems and gaps in the study of Kemalism, this book deals with the significance of incorporating non-Western interpretations of Kemalism by examining how Kemalist transformation, and particularly the ideology of Kemalism, were seen and interpreted by Soviet observers between the 1920s and 70s. How Kemalism was perceived in the Soviet Union hasn't been an object of scholarly analysis. How the West perceived Turkey has always been a matter of scholarly debate, both inside and outside the country. Undoubtedly, the West was mostly restricted to Europe and North America. This is why the Soviet historiography of Kemalism was not a matter of interest. Western academics were poorly motivated to study Northern or Soviet perspectives on Kemalism, although the Soviet Union has attracted more attention for numerous reasons. Due to the popularity of leftist views among Turkish intellectuals, the study of Soviet perspectives on Kemalism remains sparse. So this study tackles the following interrelated questions. What are the major problems in the existing interpretations of Kemalism, and how can the incorporation of Soviet perspectives enrich our understanding of Kemalism? And a few sub-questions, which are, What are the major transformative stages of Kemalism and how are they different from each other? How did different development stages influence the interpretations of Kemalism? And how significant is the incorporation of Soviet interpretations of studying Kemalism? And what factors shape the Soviet perspectives? So the argument of this book is that Turkey's westernization model has powerfully shaped the historiography of Kemalism. By drawing on non-Western, in this case Soviet perspectives on Kemalism, this book challenges and contributes to our understanding of Republican Turkey and its history. Beginning in the 1920s, Soviet research institutions and scholars, together with Communist Party functionaries and diplomats, scrutinized power relations inside Turkey. Not only the concepts of Marxism-Leninism, but also geopolitical concerns influenced their critical views and interpretations of Kemalism. Identifying the meanings, virtues, and weaknesses of Kemalism, they insisted on the political significance of classes and class relations for understanding basic structures featuring the Turkish politics and society. They recognized early on the inherent contradictions of Kemalism ideological hegemony and the inevitable social and political consequences. This rift curbed Kemalism's popularity and precluded the broader legitimacy that its advocates sought in society. This divide also portended the religious turn in Turkish politics that started in the 1950s and would come to dominate the conservative political parties. So the book has 8 chapters. The first chapter discusses the problems of definition and historiography of Kemalism, mostly discussing the gaps in the existing definitions. The second, third, and fourth chapters are about discussion of Kemalism and its major transformational phases from the 1920s all the way to 1970s. Then the sixth chapter discusses the problems of perspectives of existing interpretations of Kemalism by trying to expand the existing interpretations and trying to come up with new framework for analysis. And the last second chapters are discussing the Soviet interpretations of Kemalism. The seventh chapter, it is the most eventful the decade in terms of understanding Kemalism, because most of the discussions about Kemalism took place in the 1920s, and the last chapter discusses the developments from the 1930s all the way to 1970s. While the literature on Kemal Atatürk is considerable, discussion of his revolutionary reforms and policies has been marked by a lack of consensus on relevant terminology. At the outset, the national movement, different expressions emerged both in Turkey and abroad: inter alia, Kemalist, Kemalist movement, Kemalist revolution, Kemalist Turkey, and so on, which amounted to mere generalizations and descriptive terms. Later, when it became apparent that the Kemalist revolution was not limited to the struggle for independence, but also incorporated the internal affairs of the state, a new general term, Kemalism, emerged. Many observers use this term as a synonym for describing the Kemalist revolution, with an emphasis on its political and social content. So it took some time before Kemalism acquired ideological connotations. Throughout subsequent decades, the principles of perceptions of Kemalism, deliberately or otherwise, went through transformation, reformation, and deformation. Politicians and observers alike have sought to attach new meanings and content to Kemalism. As a result, Kemalism was overstretched and narrowed to its core ideas. One of the profound implications of this pursuit was that it eventually acquired a second name, Atatürkism, or Atatürkçülük. Since its inception, Kemalism produced divergent interpretations and schism over its meaning, not only during its active period, what was also called as an era of high Kemalism, but also after its decline. Different interpretations of Kemalism and ways of referring to it, like Atatürkism, Inonyoism, left Kemalism, right Kemalism, post-Kemalism, neo-Kemalism, can also be seen as indivisible features of many political ideologies. Different efforts to interpret Kemalism proceeded along its 6 principles, or by taking more holistic approaches. Most of the time, the study of Kemalism is seen and understood along its 6 principles. However, these variations and approaches also challenge the traits of Kemalism. The literature on Kemalism is abundant with various characterizations, like a mere ideology, a state ideology, soft ideology, an official ideology, governing philosophy, etc. In addition to these definitions, many others also exist, which are addressed in more detail in the book. Although these formulations dominated the scholarship for decades, some contain limitations, contradictions, and outright problems. So, for the sake of analytical and terminological clarity, this research identifies Kemalism both as an ideology and a system of principles. This study uses these two concepts interchangeably, depending on the period and context. Kemalism as an ideology is viewed as a normatively constructed collection of ideas and concepts which are endorsed by a political party or by state institutions like armed forces, judiciary, and Kemalism as a system of principles implies an extensive application of circumstantially adjusted ideas, norms, values, and visions by different agents, which however fail to properly contextualize and elaborate the system. This analysis refrains from depicting Kemalism as a single and unitary ideological construct or political project. This approach is based on the argument that since its inception, Kemalism underwent various transformations, both in form and content, and subsequently each period marked by radical domestic and global shifts and challenges, military interventions, regime change, left its mark on the shape and essence of Kemalism and vice versa. Scholars of Republican Turkey refer to the history of Kemalism mostly starting from the 1929 when the term first was put into circulation. However, there are also other perspectives suggesting that Kemalist principles were born in the 18th century. Some are suggesting that they were born in the 19th century or the Tanzimat Reform in 1839. Mustafa Kemal himself preferred the specific date, May 19th, 1999, when he landed in Samsun. Others have picked different dates, like December 24th, 1919, when Mustafa Kemal delivered his ideologically driven speech in Kirşehir. Others claim that the history of Kemalism should be dated from October 29th of 1923, when the Republic was established. But overall, it is widely accepted that the 6 principles were incorporated into the Republican People's Party program in 1931, and the term Kemalism was first introduced in 1935, and it became part of the Constitution. So the party programs became part of the Constitution in 1937. So this book ends in 1970s because this decade signified the plurality of manifestations of different facets of Kemalism. The 1918 military intervention was a deliberate effort to restore statist, republican, nationalist, and secular traditions. So when we look at the historiography of Kemalism, we see some interesting patterns. First of all, at the beginning, we see that in the 1940s, 50s, 70s, all the way, Kemalism was widely seen as an ideology or pragmatic set of ideas. It was also seen as a quasi-ideology or soft ideology. Some also looked at Kemalism as a state-led development model. But in the 1980s and 90s, we see that Kemalist studies were transformed, and different meanings were attached to Kemalism and its principles, and it was seen as a root cause of many problems and anachronism in the Republic in Turkey. Some talked about the abuse of Kemalism, some talked Kemalism as a conservatism. Kemalism was also seen as an anti-intellectualism, as ethnocentric nationalism, illiberalism, and anti-democratic intellectual creed. So if we look at the key findings from the literature, we see that Kemalism is mostly seen as a system of sought ideas and visions. It was used as a source of legitimacy for elite and opposition, and there were shifting and contradictory contested interpretations of Kemalism, that the ruling party had to shift its and renew its party politics at least 4 times in the 20th century in order to meet the rising demands and the challenges of contested multi-party democracy, and how Kemalism was used and abused by different stakeholders. So one of the chapters discusses different phases of Kemalism, like I said, the 6th chapter, which I want to talk a little bit more, and that is where I look at Kemalism as local manifestations of global fascism. Scholars have argued that there is no compelling evidence to prove that in the first half of the 20th century, Turkey went through a process that resembled contemporary totalitarianism in Europe and elsewhere. As a result, previous efforts to study Turkey's possible experience with fascism have shared a few common features. One has been the fact that previous approaches failed to mitigate conceptual, semantic, methodological, and theoretical flaws. So in this chapter, sixth chapter, I address these issues and argue that Kemalism, at least in the first half of the 20th century, should be, and the Young Turks ideology should be seen as local manifestations of global fascism. And so, when we come to the study of Kemalist historiography, we understand a number of patterns are emerging. First of all, in the last 5 years, number of books have been published. And interestingly, all of them look at Kemalism from transnational perspectives, trying to bring new ideas and new perspectives on the study of Kemalism. I want to study with a book by Naeem Qureshi, a Pakistani historian, who published this book in 2014, and he argues that Indian Muslims in the 1920s and 30s looked at Kemalism for inspiration. The leaders of Indian Muslims were inspired by the Kemalist reforms and were looking for Mustafa Kemal as a role model. Another book by Stefan Ihrig, Atatürk in the Nazi Imagination. This book argues that Mustafa Kemal, Kemalism, and Kemalist reforms were a source of inspiration for Hitler, and Hitler was inspired by Mustafa Kemal Atatürk and his deeds, and how the how the right-wing press was using Mustafa Kemal and his deeds as building a prototype for the Nazi Germany. The other book by Panache Dosmiego looks at Kemalism from the French perspective. Again, in the 1920s and 30s, how Mustafa Kemal was seen a good dictator, and how he was positively seen in the French media. This other book called Kemalism, the Transnational Politics in the Post-Ottoman World, was published a few months ago, and it looks at Kemalism from the Balkan, Middle Eastern, and North African perspectives. Again, trying to use the Kemalist model as an inspiration for Balkan countries and for North African countries, and how they were inspired by the emancipation program of Kemalism, how they used the the Turkish alphabet, Latin alphabet model, and so on. There were also an article by Jacob Landau was published last year in the Middle Eastern Studies Journal, which basically argues that Kemalism was a source of inspiration also for many Jewish politicians, especially Ben-Gurion, the first president of Israel. He looked at Mustafa Kemal for inspiration. Other books like Turaj Atabaki that discuss how Iran and Afghanistan looked at Kemalism for inspiration. How Reza Shah and Amanullah Khan, they visited Turkey in the 1920s, and how they were inspired by these reforms. They went back and tried to implement some of these reforms with limited success. However, when we look at this, we see that one link is missing, and that link is Soviet Union, the Soviet Union. How could the Soviet Union escape from this picture? Why the Soviet perspectives are missing? How could a country which had such a significant role in the creation of Turkey be missed and left out from this Kemalist studies? So that's why when I studied the historiography, this gap came out, and I wanted to explore the reasons for the absence. So when we try to understand the absence, the reasons for the absence of the Soviet views, we see that most of the time the scholars have been quite busy trying to understand the issues of bilateral relations or geopolitical issues, Cold War politics, but never paying attention how Kemalism was seen by the Soviet Union, by different actors, observers, diplomats. So this is quite interesting, and it attracted my attention. However, it doesn't mean that there was no literature on Kemalism. So if you look here, so in 1979, the National Academy of Sciences published this interesting reference book called Kemalism. And as you can see here above, it says for official use only on the left. And here it brings 450 titles from international, from foreign books published between 1930 and 76, and only based on the fonts in Leningrad and Baku. Another bibliography of Turkey on the right-hand side, we see that this book contains 18,000 titles of books published about Turkey, and everybody in Armenia who is willing to go into Turkish studies, this is the first thing they study, how rich was Soviet literature on Turkey and on different aspects of development. I also looked at periodicals of the period. As you can see from the titles, I have grouped them into four parts: the Communist Party periodicals, the Comintern periodicals, People's Commissariat of Foreign Affairs periodicals, which is basically foreign ministry, and research institutions. So some of these journals are still published, by the way. Some of them with more revolutionary titles ceased to be published. Here we also see some of the designs of the time in the 1920s. Quite interesting. So the one here is the Problems of Turkey, a never-ending question. Here, Turkey, another interesting design. The one here on the which says the Kemalist Turkey. The Kemalist world, is it possible in China? Overall, we see how interesting that they are designed at the time in the 1920s. Again, in the 1920s, we see lots of interesting designs and how the term Kemalism was widely used by Soviet observers. We see the essence of Kemalism. A new effort to analyze Kemalism. Imperialist rebirth of Kemalism. Kemalism and Islam, Kemalism today. So what makes this interesting, why I emphasize this, that for the first time the word Kemalism in Turkey is used in the 1929. However, in this case we see that the Soviet politicians, Soviet observers were so vested, was so well informed about domestic developments of Turkey that they could afford using the term Kemalist. When we try to understand the different views on Kemalism, we also see that the Soviet historiography is quite rich, is so rich that we can draw some groups and try to analyze them along these groups. The first, which is also rather interesting, are the reports from diplomats. The Soviet diplomats were posted to Ankara and Istanbul. They were writing diplomatic reports to Moscow, trying to share their perspectives on the developments. So Astakhov, Aralov, which is mostly known for people working on Turkish-Soviet relations, used Miller. These are people who work extensively on Turkey, wrote books while being diplomats. The other groups look at the political and intellectual origins of Kemalism. Others try to exaggerate the Soviet influence, trying to show that without the Soviet influence, the Kemalist Turkey would never succeed. Others were more critical, and I will discuss in a second why 1927 is a turning point in understanding the Kemalist transformations and Soviet perspectives. So we see these scholars mostly looked at Kemalism from radically critical perspectives, while here we see mostly supportive interpretations of Kemalism. And then what is also interesting, before the term was being widely used in Turkey, Soviet scholars were writing review papers, review books about the articles that were being published about Kemalism. So we see very dirty side of Soviet scholarship, how the new Marxist Orientalists were trying to criticized those scholars, mostly these accomplished scholars, Astafov and others, Petrovich, Gurko-Kryazhin, who failed to interpret Kemalism from along with Marxist and Leninist methodology. So the Soviets knew quite well Turkey of the 1920s and 30s. So they had hands-on experience. There were a number of joint projects that were carried out between in Turkey with the Soviet help. We all know from history textbooks that 2 textile factories were built in Turkey in the 1930s in Kayseri and Nazilli. The Soviets helped also to renew for instance, the road system, communication system of Turkey. They sent 100 buses, for instance, in 1930s to Turkey. Another interesting thing that Soviet scholars were traveling to Turkey quite a lot. So they had hands-on experience, and they were coming back writing extensive reports to Communist Party leadership. Another interesting aspect that Soviet Union had the 4th biggest diplomatic representation in Turkey in the world. So it attached so much importance that around 95 diplomats were working in the Soviet diplomatic missions and in the consulates in Turkey. However, why the Soviet Union was motivated to study Kemalism? First of all, the major point was that they wanted to secure Turkish neutrality and reduce anti-Soviet sentiments among Kemalists. They wanted to keep Turkey in check by engaging with it. And another interesting thing is from time to time, the Soviet Union would approach Turkey and try to use the Turkish influence in the Muslim world. So there are some interesting diplomatic cables showing how the Soviet diplomats were trying to create Kemalism for Iran, Kemalism for Afghanistan, Kemalism for China. The most interesting, the China case. In 1927, there was a big discussion in the Soviet Union whether Kemalist model of development was possible to export to China. So Kemalism was seen as a role model by some observers. However, the intervention by Stalin changed the discussions. We'll see in a second. We need also to keep in mind that Oriental studies have been traditionally quite strong in the Soviet Union, mostly coming from the Tsarist period. And what makes the Soviet approaches unique is that they provided earlier conceptualization of Kemalism, which was not present in the literature on Kemalism in the 1920s. And of course, they had to provide the Marxist-Leninist dimensions, and they were looking for role models for revolutions, and we'll see in a second how it unfolded. So the turning point, of course, was 1927 when Stalin came up with his own definition of Kemalism. Again, 1927, still 4 years to go before Turkey comes up with his own Kemalism, definition of Kemalism. So the Turks, the Soviets were the first to offer new recalibration and adjustment of Kemalism, and they were able to discuss the implications of Kemalism on the social fabric. Those who study the Soviet history know that in the 1920s there were around 200 new institutions, research institutions created in the Soviet Union. Some of the names you see here: Institute of Red Professors, Sverdlov Communist University, Institute of Marx and Engels, Stalin Communist University of Toilers of the East, Communist Academy. So we see a new battle between the classical Orientalists who were coming from the Tsarist era and the newly rising Marxist-Leninists who had to fight in order to advance the Marxist-Leninist interpretation of Kemalism. And then we come to the famous definition of Stalin that he made in 1927 in front of the Chinese students. So as you can see here, he shows disappointment about the progress of Kemalist revolution. He basically argues that Kemalism has changed its nature, it's against peasantry and workers, it's against the very possibilities of an agrarian revolution, and then he also argues that it's stuck in the first phase, the bourgeois liberation movement, and the agrarian revolution is not going to take place in Turkey. So it was a strong signal to the people working on Turkey in Soviet Union that they have to change their interpretations. So it was a direct order, sort of the Stalinist orthodoxy, that the nice approach that existed in the Soviet Union towards Turkey needs to be amended. So what makes the Soviet views unique? Like I said, unlike other approaches at the time, the Soviet approaches were less congratulatory and they were mostly critical of Kemalism. And we see also in the Soviet approaches a complex interplay of disappointment and hope. So the key findings, if I can sum up, are the following ones. So the debates and discussions in the Soviet literature are quite informed, and we can rely on the substance, but when it comes to the critical aspects, we have to be a little careful because Marxist-Leninist methodology that is being used adds some ideological layers, and we have to be careful. So because of this critical approach, the Soviets were able to discuss and show early on that Kemalism had a limited penetration on the periphery, that it remained very urban, very elitist ideology, and it had only limited grassroots support. And unlike many scholars working on the field, even in the 1920s and 30s, Soviet observers were first to pinpoint, to identify that there is a deep process of merging the state and the party. An argument that was made by foreign observers in 1935, but the Soviet politicians and observers were making this argument already in 1927 when Mustafa Kemal delivered his 36-hour speech. We also see the Soviet observers were very critical, showing, discussing the fact that the RPP, the Republican People's Party, the founding party of Turkey, had a poor institutional character and nature, and it was never a strong party in the 1920s and 30s. It didn't have many members, and for that reason, we see how the Soviets were able to foresee the future of the RPP. And the last point is that we see that most of the time geopolitics shaped interpretations, Soviet interpretations of Kemalism. In times where the Soviet-Turkish relations were good, the Soviets were changing their perspective, saying Kemalism still has a potential, the agrarian revolution can still happen. But once the relations were not good, they were starting to criticize Kemalism as much as they could, especially starting from 1930s, mid-1930s, all the way to 1960s. They spared no words to say all the bad things about Kemalism and its future. Like, for instance, they were calling the populist principle of Kemalism fascism, nationalism. They were calling it pan-Turkism. So we see this the shift in the approaches in the Soviet observations and analysis. And this brings to an end of our analysis. And I want to thank you for coming. We also are going to continue. Dr. Areshan has prepared a number of questions about the book. Four questions, if I'm not mistaken. And then after that we can have Q&A session. Yes.
A couple of practical notes for consideration. For those of you who may be interested, this talk is going to be offered at the National Academy of Sciences in Armenian at some point in the next couple of weeks, so keep an eye out for that announcement. And secondly, in the event you're interested in purchasing the book, we only have a few copies tonight. But if you approach Ani Shahoyan, Ani, wave your hand so everyone knows. She has some flyers that will offer you a publisher's code that offers an author's discount so that you can purchase the books online if you like. Tonight's respondent needs no introduction, the eminent archaeologist and historian Dr. Gregory Areshian, author of more than half a dozen books and countless articles in interdisciplinary studies within the social sciences. Dr. Areshian, thank you.
Thank you everybody for coming. So we are going also after this brief dialogue, we are going to also entertain questions, and whoever wants can also obviously ask the questions in Armenian, and we'll answer either in English or in Armenian depending on the question. Ուրեմն ովքեր որ ցանկանան այս փոքրիկ փոփոխությունից հետո հարց տալ հայերեն համեցեք, դուք մենք հաճույքով կպատասխանենք կամ հայերեն կամ անգլերեն, նայած ինչ լեզվով է հարցը. So let me say for 3 or 4 minutes why I was so excited about this presentation of Professor Termatevosyan's book. First of all, I very much, I am a Brodelian type historian of the longue durée, which means I always favor to analyze the longer term processes. That's why, as geologists talk about me, oh, he studies today, the yesterday, which means from about 10,000 before present up to the middle of this 21st century, 2040, 2050. So it's all contemporary. And so what interested me specifically in this book were 2 of its aspects. First, it is a very deep insight in the 3rd attempt of the modernization of Turkey. We as world historians or Middle Eastern historians or Armenian historians, we need to learn Turkey much better than we know. And there is this big question that immediately affects us, all of us today, in Armenian-Turkish relations. Turkey tried to modernize 4 times. 4 times. And all 4 times it failed to some extent. And it started, the roots of modernization started after the beginning of the decline of the Ottoman Empire in 1683, the second siege by the Ottoman forces of Vienna, and then it declines until the times of the Greek War of Independence, 1828-29, when the very existence of Ottoman Turkey was questioned by historical developments to the extent that the Ottomans didn't have any single military force to fight the Greek national rebellion supported by the British, Russian and French, and they had to bring Muhammad Ali from Egypt to fight against them. And so that resulted in the first attempt of the Tanzimat Reforms that many of you know quite well, the first attempt at modernization, westernization of Turkey. And so that first modernization failed. Again, many of you know why and how, but then there was the second attempt at modernization with the Young Turk Revolution, which failed even sooner and even faster. If the Tanzimat lasted for from 1830s to 1860s, the Young Turks Revolution as the source and inspiration and consequent modernization of Turkey lasted only for 5 years, 6 years, until 1911, 1912, the First Balkan War. And then there was this most powerful attempt at modernization, which was the modernization of Kemal Atatürk, which probably had the strongest impact actually in the changes of the Turkish society, which again was not able to achieve its eventual goal and completely the way was perceived modernize the Turkish society. So we have these extreme contentions within the Turkish society and struggle, especially when we are thinking about the 1970s and before, military coups and so on. And then we are coming to 2002, 2003, the very important, not great, but very important revolution led by Erdogan, which almost remained unnoticed in the Armenian environment, and these big changes, big progressive changes. When Erdogan went, he was sitting in jail, struggling with the ruling regime, supporting and promoting freedoms, supporting minorities, having a pro-Western orientation, and then taking over power and being a very progressive leader until came the economic decline of Turkey and the following immediately military coup of 2016, where he went essentially very much back to the positions of quite extreme authoritarianism. So for us it's extremely, building our relationship with Turkey, it's extremely important to understand the reasons, the causes of these four historical failures. And for the understanding of the second failure, the work of our distinguished colleague Professor Bahram Matevosyan is extremely important, because he gives this different diverse perspective, not only on Kemalism, but also on its development. And so what I would like to wish, first of all, before I ask now and go to my questions, I wish very much to have this book translated into Armenian and published as soon as possible, because it will very much change our attitude, completely change to how much we know about Turkey. Because if I may, I will say one more thing. Our Armenian attitude toward Turkey and Turkish history are very much shaped by the great tragedy of the Armenian genocide. And on the other, the second big factor that shaped is that we very much follow the Western European and Russian interpretations of Turkish history, which very much, and we discussed that in our classes on Middle Eastern history, absolutely do not correspond neither to realities, historical, on the Western side, nor to many Armenian sources. Because if you think, briefly, the Western perception is, oh, those terrible Seljuks came, they destroyed the Byzantine Empire, and everything after that, there was a war between, and all the time conflicts between the Ottomans, who are direct descendants of the Seljuks, and then throughout the Ottoman history. And that's what affected also very much, and that's why the struggle between Europeans and the Ottomanism also had an impact on the formation of the Armenian point of view. We forget the very fact that when in 1299 the Beylik of Osman started developing, from all the facts that we know, until Selim Yavuz, which means until, essentially to put a big mark, 1512, the Battle of Chaldan. For 200 years, the Ottomans were not interested in Anatolia. They were not interested in conquering the eastern parts of Anatolia, conquering Armenia or the Middle East and so on. They were all striving to create their empire in southeastern Europe, in Europe. All their interest was continuously in Europe until, as I'm saying, they captured Constantinople and then later turned to the east. So these are the big questions that we need to understand very well, because neither the Turks nor we are not going to disappear from our places. And we need to understand deeper our history. And so, as I said, as a long-term historian, I appreciate very much the interpretations of different concepts and theories, but I always myself, and I am teaching the students that go and start from primary sources and look at how people who created policies, who made change, how they themselves looked at those, at their own activities. Like when a student comes and tries to tell me something very emotionally and so on, I'm asking, please explain me why this is happening to you, why do you behave like this? And so my first question will be, so that since Professor Matevosyan, you characterize Kemalism both as an ideology and a set of premises, and they wonderfully analyze all their interpretations. So my first question will be, how, to what extent and how Atatürk himself conceptualized and later theorized his own activities before they became like were interpreted as Kemalism in general.
Well, thank you, Dr. Areshan, for that quite survey of Ottoman history. I guess what you said in the first part is very important. How well do we know Turkey? How deep is our understanding of Turkey and domestic developments in Turkey and different dimensions of Turkish politics and history? Now, back to your question, I guess there are a number of issues that needs to be discussed here. First of all, Kemalism, Mustafa Kemal himself, according to the existing interpretations and views in the historiography, he was not interested in advancing Kemalism. This is how the Turkish historiography presents Atatürk, that he was very pragmatic in his approaches towards ideological construction of Turkey. It was his entourage who was forcing and pushing him to come up with this ideological construction. He himself was not interested. But this is something that is not valid claim. He himself was interested quite well. Otherwise, without his knowledge, without his approval, Kemalist principles could never be incorporated into the program, RPP program in 1931. Without his blessing, without his green light, that principles could never be part of Constitution in 1937. However, we need to also know that there were more radical approaches towards Kemalism, advancing Kemalism. In the Turkish political elite, there were people who wanted to adopt the fascist model of development. In the 1930s, especially Recep Peker, the Secretary General of the Republican People's Party, he was pushing ahead the agenda of imitating the fascist model. So it's quite interesting. The fascists were inspired by Kemalists, and then in the 1930s we see how Kemalists were inspired by fascists. So this is a rather interesting development in the 1930s. Starting from 1930s, we also see how Kemalists were organizing revolutionary courses and lectures in different parts of Turkey. Again, I cannot imagine that this could happen without the approval of Mustafa Kemal. However, against this background, we need to see that starting from 1935, Mustafa Kemal was not actively involved in day-to-day politics. He, because of health deterioration, he had to sideline a little bit from everyday politics. However, his absence from active politics was supplemented by more and more active discussion of Kemalism or right-wing Kemalism. This is why this area is also called the era of high Kemalism. So he was deeply involved in the elaboration process. He was trying to distance himself from time to time. But again, there were so many fractions within his own party that one of the best ways to bring them all together was to unite under this Kemalist ideology and to push the Kemalist principles as far as he could.
Thank you. Thank you very much. My second question that I thought a lot about by reading your book, could you please elaborate on the internal contradictions within the ideology of Kemalism? Because those internal contradictions were actually very closely related to the policies of the Turkish Republic, both under Kemal and after Kemal himself.
One thing we should understand when we discuss Kemalism is that what we saw 6 principles is just one of the aspects of Kemalism. Kemalism has many other notions and concepts that come to enrich these 6 principles. So these 6 principles act like the core ideological construction. There are many more which are around Kemalism. They come in and go out from time to time. But I want to also stress, that it is also discussed in the second chapter, that from the early days on, Mustafa Kemal was very much interested in systematic approaches towards Turkish development. He was, from time to time, he was proposing conceptual frameworks. These are known as 9 principles, and then later on in 1927, when he delivered his 66-hour speech to this great Congress, he also was talking about importance of talking to the people along with concepts, along with principles. He was very much influenced with the dominant features of the 1920s and 30s. This is yet another interpretation, I would say, the global trend of conceptualization of politics in the 1920s and 30s. From that perspective, we do see some contradictions. When you would ask someone from Turkey what principles have survived from out of Kemalism, they would say 2 principles are left out of 6. That is nationalism and republicanism. Others have one way or another deformed or reformed. I think that Kemalist principles were quite complementary back in the 1920s and 1930s when they were first created. However, they had also much foreign influences on them. For instance, the Soviet influence on at least one principle, that is etatism, that is the state control over the economy. That was quite interesting. So that principle was mostly created and shaped, inspired by the Soviet model of development. So other contradictions it's also interesting that from 1931 to 1938, the people who wrote the Republican People's Party program, they were very careful how to approach Kemalism, how to contextualize Kemalism, and how to put it at the core of writing other principles of Kemalism. So we see very careful approach of elaboration of Kemalism in the 1920s and 30s. Later we see how that was changed by different actors, especially Inonu, who tried to bring more bureaucratic approach towards Kemalism. And then we see how it was mostly influenced by leftist politics in Turkey in the 1960s and 70s. So these internal contradictions and its possibility to overstretch allowed many players, stakeholders, to benefit from internal contradictions that existed in Kemalism.
So you already started answering my third question, which is to what extent there was a substantial or not such a substantial impact of the Soviet political worldview of the 1970s, early 30s on Kemal's political views and actions.
Yes, I partly also already answered, but I want to emphasize that in the 1920s and 30s, many Kemalist intellectuals were traveling to the Soviet Union extensively. They were going there in order to learn the Soviet experience, but they were mostly touched by the fact, they were impressed by the fact that the Great Depression of 1929 bypassed the Soviet Union, or at least they wanted to see that way. And based on that, they, especially Yakub Kadri Karaosmanoglu, one of the leading figures, actually he's seen as a person who first invented the term Kemalism in Turkey. So he was seen as a person who had to bring the Soviet approach, and it is under his influence that in 1934 Turkey adopted its first 5-year plan of development, very much influenced by the Soviet model of development, of the central model of development. We do see many manifestations of Soviet ideological approach, but not to the extent that Soviets would like to. Especially the nationalist principle, or voices the laïc principle, the secularism, was something of atheism, if you want to use that word, atheism in a la Turk model. It's interesting, in 1932, when Inonu, the Prime Minister of Turkey, visited the Soviet Union, he was taken to Kiev to anti-religious museum. So that museum was called Anti-Religious Museum. And obviously he had to give his consent, prior consent, in order to be taken to this museum. Of course, Turks didn't go as far as the Soviet Union went in terms of uprooting religion. But there were some radical movements inside Turkey who were trying to imitate the Soviet model of atheism, but they were not successful.
Very interesting. I just need to add a very brief footnote to this, because one of the very important people in the entourage of Atatürk, who for several years served as his secretary, his personal secretary, was Hamid Zubair Kashai, who was a Tatar from Kazan who started Turkish language and moved then to Turkey. And why I know this, it's because I studied Atatürk's interest in the reconstruction or reinvention of Turkish history, and especially the centrality in this reconstruction of history of Atatürk's interest toward archaeology. But now I'm not going to talk about archaeology, I'm going to talk about today. So my last question would be, what is the impact or role, what is the impact of Kemalism on current socio-political and cultural developments in Turkey, if there is any?
Oh, it's huge. Even though in the introduction I said that some are debating about the current relevance of Kemalism, some are debating about its current applicability, but I think that Kemalism is still alive in Turkey. We see also in the recent election results, so as was mentioned, I was in Turkey last week, we see that how, especially the secularists in Turkey, are so much consolidated in the fight against widening conservatism and Islamism. So they are, again, they are relying on Kemalism, on a number of principles of Kemalism in order to fight back against Erdogan. So Erdogan came to power thanks to Kemalism. He was, some are even saying that his creed, his branch of politics should be called neo-Kemalism, because he was able to use some of the components of Kemalism, like nationalism and republicanism, in order to create a new bond in politics.
And modernization.
And modernization under different pretexts, of course. So that, yes, so we cannot understand today's Turkey without understanding Kemalism. Some number of problems, the root causes of number of problems of today's Turkey goes back at least 1920s, if I would say even 1870s, 1880s, 90s, because that's temptation that many analysts around the world are finding themselves in, and that is to look at Turkey in its current context without studying the history. But Kemalism gives answers to many questions that Turkey is facing. Thank you.
Okay, now we are going to open the floor for questions, and who would be the first? Harceri Hamar, Batse, Dashto, Yev, Khantren, Ove Arachinelino. Yes, please, Professor Terkürelian.
Thank you and congratulations, Bahram. This was wonderful. Maybe the question is not so centered on Kemalism. It's more my ignorance, probably. But the granting of Nakhichevan and Karabakh to Azerbaijan, was it affected by the relationship between the Soviet Union and Turkey? If so, can you explain it?
Yes, very much so. So in 1921, as we all know, two treaties were signed, first in Moscow in March and then in October of 1921, and these two treaties, actually the second one was a replica of the first one with some modifications. These became these agreements which shaped the current borders between Armenia, Georgia, and Armenia, Georgia. So later on, actually, it is only in beginning of 1930s that 8 kilometers were exchanged with Iran, and Turkey got access to Nakhichevan. Before that, they didn't have direct access. So we see, and therefore this aspect is also interesting because it shows, this Kemalist historiography shows that after the Kars Treaty, after Moscow Treaty, and after Lausanne Treaty, they were done with borders. But it's wrong, it's debatable, because we see this strong trend of irredentism. We see a strong trend of bringing back what was left out from the Misak-Milli, this agreement that was, this document that was adopted in 1920 with quite big borders of Turkey than they currently have. Out of this Misak-Milli, for instance, Mosul was left out, Cyprus, northern Cyprus was left out, southeastern part of Europe, the European southeastern part was left out, some parts from Greece and Bulgaria. Yes, and then Iskenderun was, Alexander Sanjak was annexed by Kemalist Turkey in 1939. We see this very interesting contradictory trend, and in the times of, during the Second World War, we see how the Turkish nationalists, especially the young Turks who returned back to Turkey, and they were so much inspired by this Hitler that they wanted to use opportune moment also to attack on Soviet Armenia, and there are hundreds of documents proving the fact that Turks were waiting for the opportune moment, even though they declared neutrality during the Second World War. But it is called pro-German neutrality. So there is no shortage of seeing how the Turks are behaving when it comes to the borders. Even in 1974, when they occupied 38% of Cyprus, and now what they are doing in the northern part of Syria, we see a clear trend and continuation in the behavior, trying to bring the lands back which were left outside of Misak-Milli, this important document of 1920. So therefore, there was this interesting research done by Turkish scholars suggesting that every third rifle in the Kemalist war against the Armenian Greeks were the rifles produced in Russia and provided by Russians, by Lenin in 1920. We see these very interesting dynamics in their relations and how they affected Turkey's stand towards Armenia. So from this perspective, 1920-21 were shifting years in understanding a number of aspects. And when we speak also about this, I want to mention also the Armenian perspective on Kemalism. This is something that I plan to work in the future. How the Armenian intellectuals in the 1920s looked at Kemalism. And for instance, two people are discussed here, Ruben and Shahan Natali, in the 1920s. We have this wonderful exchange of letters between Shahan Natali and Ruben, trying to discuss the future of Kemalism in 1927. So Shahan Natali is mostly trying to offer more realistic understanding of Kemalist Turkey, saying that Kemalism, what we see as Kemalism, has its roots in the 1870s. But Ruben is saying, former Minister of Defense, saying that no, Kemalism is dead, it has no future. So in the Armenian context, we see how in emigration, they discuss the future of Kemalism in a quite elaborate way. And we also see a number of Soviet Armenian scholars who are working on Kemalism. This difference especially comes interesting in the 1950s, when a number of Armenian scholars start to debate the orthodox approaches in Kemalism, and they start to debate the Soviet official position, bringing the Armenian perspective, bringing the question of the genocide. Slowly this comes to challenge the Soviet orthodoxy on Kemalism. So yes, 1921, what happened was a clear deal between Turkey, Kemalist Turkey and Soviet Russia at that time.
So very exciting to learn that you are going to write this book that will be another great contribution to Armenian studies. I'm sure that with your critical insights you will address many aspects like Boryan's interpretations, and we have many other questions there to address. And now, please, the question.
Just curious about the Kemalist parties. After the downfall of Tanzu Çiller, it seems that none of the parties that were in that vein survived. What was the reason, if Kemalism is still alive and kicking, at least on the deep state level or something like that? How come these parties kind of disappeared?
The Republican People's Party, the main party that was created in 1922, the Kemalist Party, had some difficult times after 1980 military intervention. In 1981, all the political parties in Turkey were disbanded. They were closed down, and all the previous leaders who led the parties before the military coup, they were removed from politics, allegedly in the beginning for 10 years, but then they were able to come back in 1987. So what happened in 1995 was another turning point, because we see how Denis Baykal became the leader of the Republican People's Party, and he was able to revitalize the party. The party wasn't successful for a long period of time. Actually, when the multi-party democracy started, the Republican People's Party was never able to win any elections on its own and form one-party government. It was only in 1973 and in 1977 they won the election. They were the first in the elections, but they were not able to form one-party government. So what happened after Denis Baykal became the head of the Republican People's Party? He had to bring new life to the Kemalist party, but in 1999 that party was left out. They were not able to to overcome this 10% threshold, which is, as you know, one of the highest election threshold in the world. And then, from 10 years, they were even left out of the parliament. It was in 2002 only that they were able to win this 10% threshold and come back into parliament. But the irony was that it was only the Erdogan, the conservative Islamist leader, and being in power, and then Deniz Baykal, the Kemalist leader, who was in the opposition. So this was an irony of history. And then in 2010 he was fired because of scandal, and then we see that Kılıçdaroğlu is proved to be the leader that is not as capable and not as authoritarian, not authoritarian, but as powerful as Deniz Baykal. So he's fighting all the time. There's a strong internal debate within the CHP, the Republican People's Party, how to win at least more than 30% of the election. They were never been able to do so. So I think that the Republican People's Party is stuck with some of the aspects of Kemalism, but they're also trying to renovate and renew some of the ideological components of Kemalist principles. Until now, they used the 6 principles as their party flag. Until now, they looked at, they tried to not deviate too much from Orthodox Kemalism, but they know that they have to incorporate people, supporters and voters from religious right, from conservative people. Even if 10 years ago it was unimaginable to see a member of the Republican People's Party, a headscarf woman, now you can see many supporters of CHP, Republican People's Party, with headscarves. So we can see this shift. So they understood that they cannot marginalize themselves and remain elitists. They had to incorporate new players, and this is why I think that Kemalists they have a long way to go in order to win the support of the majority and remain as a strong opposition party in Turkish politics.
Dr. Tanzimat, congratulations on your book. Thank you for this informative presentation. I would like to hear a bit more from you about how the book was received in Turkey.
Yes, so when the book was published, I received invitations from 5 universities in Istanbul and Ankara. In Istanbul, 3 universities, Ibn Haldun University, which is close, which is quite recent one. It's close to Erdogan family. The other 2 universities were Bilgi University, Istanbul Bilgi University, and Şehir University. And the other two universities in Ankara were Bilkent University, one of the biggest universities in Turkey, private universities, and TOP, which belongs mostly to the business people. Well, I have to say, there was one comment that Dr. Garbegan already mentioned, which was quite uplifting. By the way, he was a member of the Republican People's Party, so he was present during the discussion, and he said, and he approached me, not in front of everyone, he said, because of this book we have to revise a number of aspects of Kemalist historiography, or at least our history, the history of the Republican People's Party. There was one invitation to translate this book into Turkish, and now they are working on the publishing houses. It seems İletişim is interested in translating, so I'm waiting to hear from them. Overall, there were interesting questions. Of course, they were more interested to hear about the second part of the book, about the Russian interpretation, Soviet interpretations of the Kemalist Turkey. When I was talking, they were looking at each other like, how come we didn't know about this? But anyway, so it was quite interesting, and I was also glad that when introducing me, they had to mention, it was just the second day after April 24th, that in the university that belonged to Erdogan's family, they introduced me saying, dear guest, as you know, yesterday the Armenian nation, it was the Armenian genocide commemoration day, it was quite touching. I mean, we see these islands of opinionated people who can challenge, who can speak openly about the Armenian genocide. And with these contacts, basically this was an effort to tell them that, not tell them in a holistic sense, but to communicate the message that we are interested in understanding Turkey from within, like I mentioned from the beginning, because Turkey is a complex country. Turkey is a difficult country in terms of understanding internal dynamics. It has its ups and downs. Just to mention the fact that there are 150 ethnic and religious minorities living in Turkey. Even though the Turkish constitution stipulates that there are only Turks living in Turkey, but it's not the case. We all know that there are emerging identities in Turkey. And this is yet another effort to open up discussions about the Kemalist past of Turkey. Yes, that's how much I would say.
Any other questions? Ulish Hartsev? No? Everything is clear, yeah?
So the conversation can certainly continue outside during our reception. I hope that you will join us. But I'd like to invite Dr. Deklarian to say a couple of closing words, if you like, to close the event with, and then please join us at the reception. Thank you.
Well, that's impromptu. I just want to say I'm very glad that in 2011 or 12 I had this conversation with Bahram. I said, "What's happening?" And you never know. I'm very proud that one of our colleagues has this important achievement, a scholarly book. We hope that many more will happen. And Bahram, this is a wonderful piece of work. I'm not a historian, but obviously I'm hearing historians comment on that. So we congratulate you, warmly, congratulate your family, who I'm sure had a part in it, and a lot more successes, achievements in the future, including the Armenian understanding of Turkey. So congratulations, and thank you also to Professor Areshian for conducting the question and comment given. Thank you. And